At 2:30 in the afternoon on the 7th of October, 1879, the dusty main street of Bodie, California was quiet. The autumn sun cast long shadows across the wooden boardwalks. The town had been awake since dawn, as every day in a mining camp demanded. Men worked the claims, women cooked and washed, children played in the mud. But at that moment the street was mostly empty, save for a few horses tied to hitching posts and a man sweeping the front of the general store. Then, without warning, a series of gunshots erupted from the outskirts of town, near the ridge that overlooked the Bodie mine. The first shot was followed by 3 more in rapid succession. The man with the broom dropped it and ran inside. Horses reared and broke their tethers. From the saloons, men poured out into the street, pulling pistols from their belts. A woman screamed somewhere near the boarding house. Within minutes, a crowd had gathered at the edge of town. Someone was running down the hill, a man in a blood-stained shirt, shouting that there had been a murder. The sheriff, a man named John L.W.B. something who had been elected just 3 months earlier, pushed through the crowd. He asked the man who had been killed. The answer came back, a prospector named Henry Fulton, and the killer, according to the witness, was still up on the ridge, armed and hiding. What happened next unfolded in a series of actions and missed signals that would define the lawlessness of the camp. The sheriff ordered a posse of 12 men to form. They grabbed rifles and horses. They rode up the ridge in a loose formation. At 2:45, they found the body of Henry Fulton, lying face down near his claimed stake, a bullet wound in his back. The ground around him was churned with footprints. A small pouch of gold dust, still tied to his belt, had been torn open. The killer had not taken the gold. That detail would later trouble investigators. The posse fanned out, searching the rocks and pine trees for any sign of the gunman. At 3:15, one of the posse members heard a noise from a shallow cave about 50 yards away. He called out. No answer. He fired a warning shot, still nothing. The sheriff ordered the men to hold their positions. They waited. At 3:45, a man emerged from the cave, hands raised. He was a known local named Charlie Owens, a drifter who had been in Bodie for only 2 weeks. He claimed he had heard the shots but did not see who fired them. The sheriff arrested him on suspicion. But there were problems. Owens had no powder burns on his hands and his rifle had been cleaned recently. The sheriff released him that evening due to lack of evidence. How could this have happened? The answer lies in the nature of Bodie itself. The town had been founded in 1859 after gold was discovered in the hills, but by 1879 it was in its second boom. The population had swelled to over 10,000 people, mostly men, living in tents, cabins, and shacks spread across the steep slopes. The main street was a churned mess of mud and horse manure. In winter, it froze. In spring, it became a river of slime. There was no running water, no sewer system, no hospital. The only law was the sheriff, a railroad of retired lawmen who came and went, and a handful of deputy marshals funded by the mining companies. Court was held in a saloon. Judges were often drunk. Trials were quick, verdicts harsh, and appeals almost non-existent. The murder of Henry Fulton was not unusual. Bodie had a reputation for violence. In 1879 alone, there had been at least 29 killings. Only 3 of those ever led to a conviction. The rest were ruled justifiable, self-defense, or simply unsolved. The town had a vigilance committee, a group of citizens who took justice into their own hands when the law failed. Sometimes they hanged men from the rafters of the barn. Sometimes they simply ran them out of town. What investigators found in the Fulton case was a tangle of motives. Fulton had been a successful prospector. He had filed a claim on a promising vein of quartz. But the day before his death, a rival group of miners had accused him of jumping their claim. The rival group was led by a man named Evans, who had a reputation for intimidation. Witnesses reported a heated argument at the town's only hardware store the morning before the murder. Fulton had been seen buying a new shovel and a box of ammunition. He told the clerk that he expected trouble. The sheriff interviewed Evans. Evans had an alibi. He was at the assay office at the time of the shooting, having a sample tested. The clerk at the assay office confirmed this, but the clerk also added that Evans had left for 10 minutes to use the outhouse. That was enough time to walk to the ridge and back at a fast pace if one knew the shortcuts through the bushes. The 10-minute gap was the missed signal that investigators later fixated on, yet they could not prove it. The alibi stood. The case grew cold. Charlie Owens was released, but he left town the next week. No one saw him again. Fulton's claim was taken over by a company that merged the surrounding stakes. The gold from that vein eventually produced over $200,000 in its first year of operation. But the murder was never solved. What happened in Bodie was a symptom of a larger system failure. The mining camps of the American West were governed by a patchwork of federal laws, territorial statutes, and local customs that often contradicted each other. The General Mining Act of 1872 allowed individuals to claim land for mining, but it did not provide a framework for dispute resolution. When two men claimed the same ground, the only court that mattered was the one with the fastest gun. The government in Washington was 2,000 miles away. The state capital was a week's ride. The sheriff was often a local businessman whose interests were tied to the mining companies. In the Fulton case, the system failed because it was designed to fail. The posse was untrained. The evidence was mishandled. No autopsy was performed because there was no doctor. The bullet was never recovered. The murder weapon was never found. The sheriff later admitted in a letter to the county attorney that he did not have the resources to investigate properly. He had no detective, no crime lab, no fingerprint records. All he had was a revolver and a hunch. The aftermath of the murder changed Bodie in subtle ways. The town's reputation grew darker. More families left. The Vigilance Committee became more active. 2 months later, a man was hanged from a tree near the livery stable for stealing a horse. The crowd of 300 people cheered. Some said it was justice. Others said it was just another killing in a town that had forgotten the value of a life. But the story of Henry Fulton is not just about one murder. It is about the entire fabric of life in a mining camp. Every day was a struggle against mud, disease, hunger, and violence. The gold that drew men from every corner of the world was elusive. Most went broke. Some struck it rich, only to lose it to claim jumpers, thieves, or their own vices. The saloons were never empty. The dance halls were filled with women who had no other choice. The brothels operated openly, their windows lit with paper lanterns. What investigators in the Fulton case found beneath the surface was a community living on the edge of lawlessness. The systems that were supposed to protect people had not yet arrived. The courts were corrupt. The police were poor. The press was sensationalist. The churches were few. And the gold was the only god that mattered. Why the Fulton case still matters is because it is a mirror. Every mining camp had its version of Henry Fulton. Every town had its cold case. The lawlessness of the camps was not an exception. It was the rule. The myth of the Wild West, with its quick-draw heroes and clear lines between good and evil, was built on stories like this one, but the reality was far messier. It was muddy, desperate, and often unjust. The death of a prospector like Henry Fulton did not make national headlines. It was a local affair, a paragraph in the Bodie Free Press, 2 sentences in the territorial record, and then silence. But the silence itself is a document. It tells us that the systems of law and order were fragile, that they were stretched thin across a vast landscape, and that they could be broken by a single bullet on a quiet October afternoon. Now, nearly a century and a half later, the site of Bodie is a ghost town preserved as a state park. The wooden buildings are weathered gray. The streets are silent. The mud has dried. But if you walk up the ridge where Henry Fulton was killed, you can still see the remnants of his claim: a shallow trench, a collapsed timber, a rusted shovel. The gold is long gone. The law is now a ranger station. And the questions remain unanswered. Who fired that shot at 2:30 in that October day? Was it Evans? Was it Owens? Was it someone else entirely? And why did they leave the gold? The answers are buried under 100 years of dust in a camp where the only currency was gold and the only law was survival. At 8:15 p.m. on the 13th of November 1879, a fire broke out in the Bodie boarding house known as the Eureka. The building was a three-story frame structure on Main Street, housing 50 men, mostly miners working the night shift. The flames spread fast, fed by kerosene lamps, dry timber, and a stack of hay in the stable below. By 8:22, the entire east wall was engulfed. The town's volunteer fire brigade arrived 4 minutes later, but their hand pump was frozen. The water in the cistern had turned to ice at 10 degrees below zero. They tried to break the ice with axes, but it was 6 inches thick. At 8:31, the roof collapsed. 23 men died that night. 9 more were badly burned. The cause was never determined. Some said a lamp had tipped over. Others whispered about arson, a dispute over a claim that had turned personal. The inquest, held the next morning in a saloon that still smelled of smoke, lasted 30 minutes. The verdict was accidental. No charges were filed. The dead were buried in the Bodie cemetery, many in unmarked graves. What happened that night was not an isolated tragedy. It was the result of a system that had no building codes, no fire inspection, no emergency plan. The boarding houses had been constructed quickly, with cheap lumber and no thought of safety. The only firefighting equipment was a single hand pump donated by the mining company a year earlier. The volunteers had no training. The town had no hospital to treat the burn victims. The closest doctor was in Bridgeport, a 6-hour ride in good weather. By the time he arrived, 3 of the injured had already died. The fire did not change Bodie. No new regulations were passed. The boarding house was rebuilt on the same spot within 2 months, using the same materials. The dead were soon forgotten. The gold kept coming and the town kept burning. But the Eureka fire was only one part of a larger pattern of disaster. In March of 1880, a cave-in at the Standard Mine killed 14 men. The supports had been made from pine that rotted in the damp tunnels. The company had been warned by the shift boss 3 weeks earlier, but repairs were considered too expensive. The cave-in occurred at 11:40 a.m. during a powder blast. The concussion shook the entire hillside. Survivors said they heard the timber crack like a rifle shot, then a deep rumble that lasted 5 seconds. When the dust cleared, the main shaft was collapsed for 200 feet. Rescue crews worked for 3 days, but they found only bodies. The inquest ruled the deaths accidental. The mining company paid $200 to each family and moved on. How could this have happened? The answer lies in the economics of the camp. The mining companies were driven by quarterly profits. Safety equipment was a cost that could be deferred. The miners themselves were transient, often illiterate, and had no union. The only leverage they had was the threat of quitting, but there were always more men willing to take their place. In 1879 alone, over 5,000 men arrived in Bodie. Most had no mining experience. They learned on the job, which meant they learned by watching others die. The system of mine inspection was non-existent. The territorial government had passed a law in 1875 requiring annual safety inspections, but it was never enforced. The inspectors were political appointees who rarely left the capital. The mining companies paid them to stay away. The result was a death toll that rivaled the most dangerous industrial towns in the East. In Bodie's peak years from 1878 to 1881, at least 170 men died from mining accidents, fires, shootings, or disease. The exact number is impossible to know because records were poorly kept. The only certainty is that the dead were buried and the living kept working. But the lawlessness of Bodie was not limited to industrial accidents and unsolved murders. It extended to the very fabric of daily life. At 9:15 a.m. on the 17th of June 1880, a man named Samuel Grimes walked into the Bank of Bodie and demanded cash. He was holding a Remington revolver in one hand and a cloth bag in the other. The teller handed over $3,000 in gold, dust, and coins. Grimes walked out, mounted a horse, and rode east. He was never caught. The bank had no security guard, no alarm, no safe that could be locked quickly. The sheriff was out of town. The posse that formed an hour later followed the tracks into the desert, but a rainstorm had erased them. The bank lost the money. The depositors lost their savings. Many of them were miners who had entrusted their earnings to the bank because they had no other place to keep them safe. The bank closed its doors a week later. The owner fled. The town was left with a ledger full of names and debts. What investigators later found was that Grimes had been a customer at the bank for 3 months. He had opened an account with a small deposit of gold. He had been friendly with the teller. He had asked about the layout of the building, the hours of operation, and the sheriff's schedule. The teller had answered without suspicion. The bank had no policy about discussing security with customers. Grimes had simply planned his robbery with the help of information freely given. The Grimes robbery was not the first. In the previous year, there had been at least 7 bank robberies in the mining camps of California and Nevada. Most were never solved. The robbers disappeared into the vast landscapes of the Sierra Nevada or the Great Basin. The law had no jurisdiction across state lines, and the telegraph was slow and unreliable. By the time a warrant was issued, the robber was hundreds of miles away. Failure of law enforcement in Bodie was not due to laziness. The sheriff, a man named John Murphy, was known to be diligent. He kept a ledger of every crime, every arrest, every verdict. But he had only 2 deputies to patrol a town of 10,000 people spread over 6 square miles. The deputies were paid from fines and fees, not a salary. They had to collect their own evidence, serve their own warrants, and sometimes buy their own ammunition. The system was designed to be cheap, not effective. In the spring of 1881, a group of citizens petitioned the territorial legislature to create a more organized police force. The petition was denied. The mining companies opposed it because they did not want to pay higher taxes. The saloon owners opposed it because they did not want restrictions on liquor sales. The petition gathered dust in a drawer in Carson City. Bodie never got a real police department, but the lawlessness of Bodie was also internal. The town's own institutions were corrupt. At 2 p.m. on the 22nd of August 1880, a trial was held in the Bodie courthouse, a rented room above a general store. The defendant was a man named James Wheeler, accused of stealing a horse from a rancher named Thompson. The evidence was clear. Thompson had identified Wheeler as the man who rode his horse into town the previous week. The horse was found in Wheeler's stable. The jury, composed of 12 miners, took 15 minutes to reach a verdict. They found Wheeler guilty. The judge sentenced him to 3 years in the state prison, but the judge was known to be a friend of Thompson. And the jury foreman was a neighbor of the judge, and the court clerk was Thompson's brother-in-law. The trial was a formality. The outcome was predetermined. How could this have happened? The answer is that in Bodie, the law was not a system of impartial justice. It was a tool of influence. The mining companies controlled the economy. The merchants controlled the credit. The saloon owners controlled the social life. The court was simply another arena where power was exercised. The idea of a fair trial was a luxury that few could afford. The poor and the transient had no voice. They were assumed guilty until proven otherwise, and proving otherwise required money for a lawyer, time for a trial, and witnesses who were willing to testify. In the Wheeler case, the defendant had no lawyer. He had been arrested on a Thursday and tried on a Tuesday. He had no time to find witnesses. He claimed he had bought the horse from a stranger in Sonora, but he had no bill of sale. The jury did not believe him. He was taken to prison the same day. His family never saw him again. The aftermath of the trial was not outrage. It was resignation. The town had seen too many such verdicts to be surprised. The editors of the Bodie Free Press wrote a short editorial that said, "Justice has been served." The paper was owned by a man who was also a part-time deputy and a mining company shareholder. The justice that was served was the justice of the powerful. But the story of Bodie is not only about violence, corruption, and death. It is also about the daily struggle of ordinary people to survive in a place where the environment was as hostile as the people. In the winter of 1880, a blizzard struck Bodie that lasted 5 days. The snow piled up to 14 feet. The temperature dropped to 25 degrees below zero. The main road became impassable. Food ran low. The general store raised its prices by 400%. A sack of flour that cost $3 in the summer now cost $15. A pound of coffee cost $2. Men died of starvation in their cabins. The town's only doctor, a man named Samuel Kimball, traveled on skis to reach sick patients. He saved 7 lives that week, but he could not save everyone. The bodies were stored in a shed until the snow melted in March. What happened in that winter was a failure of logistics. The town had no food reserves. The supply lines were dependent on wagon trains that could not move in deep snow. The mining companies had stockpiled enough food for their own workers, but they did not share it with the rest of the town. The sheriff tried to organize a rationing system, but he had no authority over the stores. The store owners charged what they could. The poor starved. The winter of 1880 killed at least 40 people in Bodie. The exact number is unknown because the dead were often buried in unmarked graves without records. One of those who died was a woman named Sarah Cooper, a widow who had come to Bodie to find work as a cook. She had no family. She was found frozen in her cabin on the morning of the 12th of February. Her body was taken to the cemetery and buried next to the victims of the Eureka fire. She had been in Bodie for 2 weeks. Why the winter of 1880 still matters is because it reveals the deeper truth about life in a mining camp. The gold was a lure, but the reality was a constant battle against nature, isolation, and a system that valued profit over people. The camps were not communities in any meaningful sense. They were temporary aggregations of strangers, united only by greed and desperation. The bonds of neighborliness were weak. The safety nets of family and church were absent. When disaster struck, there was no one to turn to but oneself. And yet, the camps also produced moments of unexpected kindness. In the same winter, a group of Chinese laborers who worked as cooks and laundrymen opened their small shack to a family of 5 who had lost their home in a fire. The Chinese were among the most marginalized people in Bodie. They were not allowed to own land, to vote, or to testify in court. They lived in a separate quarter known as Chinatown, a cluster of shacks on the edge of town. But when the white family needed help, they took them in. They shared their rice and tea. They gave them blankets. They asked for nothing in return. The family, the Johnsons, later told the story to a reporter from the San Francisco Chronicle. The reporter wrote a long article about the generosity of the Chinese community in Bodie. The article was read widely. It did not change the attitudes of the townspeople. The Chinese were still despised. But for a moment, the story reminded people that even in a place built on greed, humanity could survive. The system of lawlessness in Bodie was not a failure of individual morality. It was a failure of structure. The mining camps were designed to extract gold as quickly as possible, with no thought for the future. The people who came were willing to accept the risks because the rewards were potentially huge. But the risks were not evenly distributed. The rich got richer, the poor died, and the law was a tool of the rich. By 1882, Bodie's boom was fading. The easy gold was gone. The deep shafts required expensive pumps and timbers. The mining companies began to consolidate. The smaller claims were bought up. The population shrank. By 1885, only 2,000 people remained. By 1890, fewer than 500. The town became a ghost in slow motion. The last murder in Bodie occurred in 1890. A man named Patrick O'Brien shot a man named Thomas Flynn over a card game. O'Brien was arrested, tried, and convicted. He was sentenced to hang. The gallows were built behind the jail. The execution was scheduled for the 15th of October. But O'Brien escaped the night before. He was never found. The gallows were dismantled. The jail was closed. Bodie's lawlessness ended not because justice arrived, but because the town itself died. The gold was gone. The people left. The buildings fell. The dust covered everything. And the stories of the dead, the hanged, the burned, and the frozen faded into the wind. But they are not lost entirely. In the archives of the Mono County Historical Society, there is a single ledger from the sheriff's office. Records the names of every person arrested, every crime charged, every verdict rendered from 1878 to 1883. The pages are yellowed and torn. The handwriting is small and cramped. In the margin of one page, next to the entry for Henry Fulton's murder, the sheriff has written in pencil, "No suspect." The murder was never solved. The killer was never found. And yet, the ledger is a testament to the system that tried and failed. It shows that the sheriff attempted to investigate. He interviewed witnesses. He collected statements. He wrote letters. But the system he worked in was broken. He had no tools. He had no support. He had no time. And in the end, the only thing he could do was record the failure. The legacy of Bodie is not a cautionary tale. It is a mirror. The same forces that created the lawlessness of the mining camps exist today in places where resources are extracted quickly, where oversight is weak, where profits are private but costs are public. The mud, the gold, the lawlessness, they are not relics of the past. They are the pattern of human behavior that repeats whenever the stakes are high and the rules are low. What happened in Bodie could happen again. In some places, it is happening now. The only difference is that the names have changed. The men still carry guns. The gold still warps judgment. The law still bends to power. And the dead are still buried in unmarked graves, their stories lost under the weight of mud and time. But sometimes the stories are not entirely lost. They surface in fragments, in old letters, in court records, in the memories of descendants. One such fragment is the story of the 1885 measles epidemic that swept through Bodie in the dead of winter. At 7:30 a.m. on the 3rd of January 1885, a child of mining engineer Henry Pritchard arrived on the stagecoach from San Francisco with a fever and a rash. The child was 8 years old. He had been visiting his grandmother in the city. He returned to Bodie with more than souvenirs. He carried the measles virus. Within 48 hours, his younger sister developed the same symptoms. Within a week, 30 children in the surrounding boarding houses and cabins were sick. The town had no public health infrastructure. There was no hospital. There was no nurse. The only physician was Dr. Samuel Kimball, now 63 years old and plagued by rheumatism. He had treated gunshot wounds, broken bones, and frostbite for years, but he had never confronted a contagious disease of this scale. Measles in 1885 was not a mild childhood illness. Malnutrition and cramped living conditions turned it into a killer. Complications included pneumonia, croup, and encephalitis. Dr. Kimball did his best. He went house to house on snowshoes. He bled patients and administered quinine. Neither treatment worked. By the end of January, 60 people were infected, 23 died. 19 of the dead were children under the age of 10. The mining companies did not close. The stamp mills ran 24 hours a day. The gold was too important. The bodies were quarantined in a shed behind the funeral parlor. There was no refrigeration. The undertaker, a man named George Watkins, worked through the nights building coffins. He ran out of wood. He used packing crates. The bodies were buried in a row at the edge of the cemetery. None of the graves were marked with a permanent headstone. The wooden crosses rotted away within a decade. Today, the exact locations of those children are unknown. What happened in that epidemic was a failure of prevention. The town had no isolation protocols. The stagecoach line did not check passengers for illness. The Pritchard child had been sent home despite being feverish because his grandmother did not want to care for a sick child. There was no health officer. There was no reporting system. The outbreak was not recorded in any official register. The only record is a single paragraph in the Bodie Weekly Times, published on the 7th of February, which stated, "The scarlet fever has passed, leaving many homes in mourning." The reporter had confused measles with scarlet fever. The error was never corrected. The epidemic of 1885 was not an isolated event. It was a predictable consequence of how mining camps were organized. The camps were designed for extraction, not for habitation. Housing was temporary, overcrowded, and uninsulated. Water came from shallow wells that were often contaminated by sewage. In Bodie, the only latrines were outdoor pits. When the ground froze in winter, the pits overflowed into the streets. The runoff seeped into the groundwater. The result was a constant cycle of typhoid, dysentery, and cholera. In the summer of 1879, a typhoid outbreak killed 12 men in a single boarding house. The cause was traced to a well located 30 feet from a privy. The mining company that owned the boarding house refused to dig a new well. They blamed the victims for not boiling their water. The health conditions in Bodie were not unusual. They were the norm across the gold regions of California, Nevada, Colorado, and Montana. In the California gold fields of 1849, cholera tore through the camps along the American River. The disease spread through contaminated water and close contact. At the peak of the epidemic, bodies were left in the streets because no one dared to touch them. The town of Sacramento lost a third of its population in the summer of 1850. The survivors fled. The camps were abandoned. The gold remained in the ground, but the price was too high. In Bodie, the lack of medical care was compounded by the absence of women. Women made up only 10% of the population. Most were wives of mine owners or merchants. A handful were prostitutes. Very few were mothers. The children who died in the 1885 epidemic were mostly the children of the few families who had brought their children to Bodie. The majority of the male population had no children. They had no stake in the future. They were there for a single purpose, to find gold and leave. The concept of a community with schools, churches, and hospitals was foreign to them. The camp was a transient space. The dead were buried quickly and forgotten, but not everyone in Bodie was indifferent. After the epidemic, a group of women organized a fundraiser to build a hospital. They held a dance at the Sons of Temperance Hall. Tickets cost $2. The event raised $300, but the money was stolen from the collection box that night. The thief was never caught. The hospital was never built. The women disbanded. The Sons of Temperance returned to their whiskey. The role of women in mining camps is often overlooked in the histories that focus on gunfights and gold strikes. But they played a crucial part in the daily survival of the camps. Women cooked, cleaned, washed laundry, and nursed the sick. Some ran boarding houses. Others opened restaurants or bakeries. A few owned saloons. The most famous of these was a French woman named Elena Dumont, who ran a gambling hall in Nevada City, California in the 1850s. She was known as Madame Dumont. She dealt faro with a steady hand and carried a pistol in her garter. She was respected and feared. But she was also cheated by men who thought a woman could not count cards. She lost her business. She drifted from camp to camp, always trying to regain her fortune. She died in poverty in 1879 in a mining camp in Montana. Her grave is unmarked. In Bodie, the most successful female entrepreneur was a woman named Mary Sullivan. She arrived in 1879 with her husband, who died of pneumonia 6 weeks later. Mary Sullivan did not return to the East. She used her savings to buy a boarding house on Main Street. She charged $1 a night for a cot and 2 meals. She fed as many as 40 men each evening. She cooked beef stew, biscuits, and dried apples. She dosed the men with whiskey when they were sick. She wrote letters for the illiterate. She kept a ledger of debts that was never collected. She died in 1898, a year after the town had shrunk to a few hundred people. Her boarding house was torn down for lumber in 1905. The boards were used to build a barn in the next valley. The lives of women like Mary Sullivan and Elena Dumont were not recorded in official histories. They left no heirs. Their names appear only in census records and obituaries, but their labor held the camps together. Without them, the men would have starved or frozen or died of disease even faster than they did. The mining camps extracted gold, but they also extracted the lives of those who served the miners. The environmental cost of the mining camps was equally severe. The gold that came out of the ground left behind a landscape of poisoned rivers and collapsed hillsides. In Bodie, the ore was processed using stamp mills that crushed rock into fine powder. The powder was mixed with mercury to extract the gold. The mercury was heated, vaporized, and lost to the air. The leftover tailings were dumped into nearby streams. The mercury flowed into Mono Lake. Mono Lake is now a saline lake with high levels of mercury in its sediment. The fish are unsafe to eat. The birds that feed on the lake have elevated mercury levels. The contamination will persist for centuries. The same story repeated across the West. In the Sierra Nevada, hydraulic mining washed entire mountainsides into rivers. The debris clogged riverbeds, destroyed farmland, and caused floods. In 1884, a federal court case halted hydraulic mining in California, but the damage was already done. The topsoil washed into San Francisco Bay. The rivers never returned to their original courses. The scars on the landscape are still visible from satellite images. In Colorado, the mining camps of Leadville and Cripple Creek left behind billions of tons of waste rock. The rock contains heavy metals like lead, cadmium, and arsenic. Rainwater seeps through the piles and carries toxic runoff into the groundwater. The streams that flow from these sites are orange with iron oxide. The fish are dead. The water is not drinkable. The Environmental Protection Agency has spent hundreds of millions of dollars cleaning up these sites. The work is not finished. The question that lingers is why the mining camps were allowed to operate with so little regulation. The answer lies in the political economy of the time. The mining industry was the engine of the Western economy. It created jobs, built railroads, and funded banks. The federal government was eager to promote settlement and extraction. The General Mining Law of 1872 allowed anyone to claim mineral rights on public land for free. The claim holder did not have to pay royalties. They did not have to restore the land. They did not have to compensate communities for the damage. The law is still in effect today. It has been amended but not replaced. The legacy of lawlessness in the legal system itself continues. In Bodie, the final blow did not come from disease, violence, or environmental collapse. It came from depletion. By 1885, the rich ore bodies were exhausted. The remaining ore was low-grade and expensive to process. The Standard Mining Company, the largest in town, closed its main shaft in 1887. The mill shut down. The workers left. The population fell from 5,000 to 2,000. The businesses that survived were the saloons, the brothels, and the general store, but they too dwindled. At 4 p.m. on the 22nd of June 1892, the Bodie Hotel burned to the ground. The fire started in the kitchen. The flames spread to the adjacent buildings. The fire department was a volunteer crew with a single-hand pump wagon. The water supply was limited. The fire destroyed 4 blocks of Main Street. The damage was not repaired. The owners of the hotel did not rebuild. They took their insurance money and left town. The end of Bodie was not a single event. It was a slow decay. The last mine closed in 1904. The post office closed in 1909. The school closed in 1920. The last resident, a man named Henry Keene, left in 1944. He had lived in Bodie for 40 years as a watchman. He died in a rest home in Bridgeport in 1994. His cabin still stands, preserved by the state park. Today, Bodie is a California State Historic Park. It is preserved in a state of arrested decay. The buildings are not restored. They are stabilized. The windows are broken. The dust covers the floors. The visitors walk through the streets and imagine the gunfights and the saloons, but they do not see the children who died of measles. They do not see the Chinese laborers who were buried in unmarked graves. They do not see the mercury that still poisons the lake. The park tells a story of adventure and rough justice. It does not tell the story of the systemic failures that turned human lives into disposable resources, but the pattern is still alive. In the 21st century, gold mining continues in Nevada, Alaska, and other parts of the world. The methods are more efficient. The regulation is stricter. But the fundamental logic is the same. The ore is extracted. The costs are externalized. The workers are exploited. The environment is damaged. The profits are private. The cleanup is public. The lawlessness of the 19th century has evolved into the legal exploitation of the 21st. In the Yukon, where the Klondike Gold Rush happened in 1897, modern mining companies use cyanide heap leaching to extract gold from low-grade ore. The cyanide solution is sprayed onto piles of rock. The solution percolates through the rock and dissolves the gold. The liquid is collected and processed, but the cyanide is toxic. Spills have occurred. In 2014, a tailings pond in British Columbia burst, releasing 24 million cubic meters of contaminated water into the Fraser River. The river turned turquoise. The fish died. The cleanup cost $1 billion. The company paid a fine of $60 million. The shareholders were not affected. The lesson of Bodie is not that lawlessness was a historical anomaly. It is that lawlessness is a recurring feature of extractive economies. When the stakes are high, the rules are bent. When the resources are finite, the future is discounted. When the powerless are silent, they are ignored. The gold rush of the 19th century is over, but the rush for oil, lithium, cobalt, and rare earth minerals continues. The mud is different. The names are different, but the human cost remains the same. And so we return to the small ledger in the Mono County Historical Society. It holds the names of the men who were arrested, the women who were forgotten, the children who were buried in rows. The ink has faded, the paper is brittle, but the record is a warning. It says, "This is what happens when profit is the only law. This is what happens when the community is a temporary camp. This is what happens when the dead have no one to speak for them." In the end, the gold was not the treasure. The treasure was the lesson, but we have not learned it. We are still digging. At 2:15 p.m. on the 16th of December 1907, a dynamite charge exploded near the Goldfield Consolidated Mines Company office in Goldfield, Nevada. The blast was loud enough to be heard across the camp. Windows shattered. A guard named James McMullen was killed instantly. Another guard, William White, was seriously wounded. The explosion came during a bitter labor dispute between the Western Federation of Miners and the mine owners. The union had been on strike for weeks. The company had hired armed detectives from the Pinkerton Agency. The town was already under a tense quiet. After the explosion, the quiet ended. Within minutes, mine owners demanded the arrest of union leaders. The sheriff, a man named John S. McGee, was himself aligned with the company. He had been appointed by the governor, who was sympathetic to the mine owners. At 3 p.m., Sheriff McGee ordered the arrest of Vincent St. John, the leader of the local WFM chapter. St. John was taken from his boarding house without a warrant. He was held in the county jail. The union called for a general meeting that evening. The saloons closed early, the streets filled with armed men. At 7 p.m., a crowd of about 400 miners gathered in front of the Union Hall. They demanded St. John's release. The sheriff refused. At 8:30 p.m., a group of men from the company's side formed a vigilante committee. They called themselves the Citizens Alliance. They were armed with rifles and revolvers. By 9 p.m., the town was divided into two armed camps. The only law was the gun. What happened next was not a battle. It was a systematic suppression. At 10 p.m., the Citizens Alliance arrested 5 more union leaders. They were taken to the jail and held without charge. The miners did not attack the jail. They knew they were outgunned. The company had brought in machine guns from the local armory. The governor, John Sparks, had already declared martial law in nearby towns. He now extended it to Goldfield. At midnight, a company of the Nevada National Guard arrived by train. They set up a machine gun position on the roof of the Consolidated Mines office. The strike was broken not by negotiation but by force. Over the next week, the Guard patrolled the streets. Union meetings were banned. The miners were told to return to work or leave town. Most returned. They had families to feed. The wages were cut by 20%. The union never recovered in Goldfield. The camp continued to produce gold, but the spirit of solidarity was crushed. But who was responsible? The immediate cause of the explosion was never conclusively determined. The prosecution claimed that union men had planted the dynamite. The defense argued that the company had staged the explosion to justify crushing the union. The trial of Vincent St. John lasted 3 months. The jury deadlocked. St. John was released. No one else was ever convicted. The question remained unanswered. Who set the bomb? The deeper story is not about a single explosion. It is about the legal and economic structures that turned a labor dispute into a war. In the early 20th century, gold mining was dominated by large corporations. The Goldfield Consolidated Mines Company was controlled by a group of Eastern financiers, including the Rockefeller family. They had invested heavily in the camp. They wanted a stable labor force that would accept low wages and long hours. The WFM was the most militant union in the West. It had led strikes in Colorado, Idaho, and Montana. The mine owners viewed it as a threat to their profits and to the social order. The state government sided with the owners. Governor Sparks had been a mining engineer and a friend of the industry. He called out the National Guard not to keep peace, but to break the union. The Guard was funded by the mine owners. The soldiers were paid out of company accounts. The legal system was compromised. The judges were appointed by the governor. The juries were drawn from a pool that excluded union members. The trial of St. John was a show of power, not a search for truth. The human cost of the Goldfield strike was not limited to the dead. Hundreds of miners were blacklisted. They could not find work anywhere in the region. Their families were evicted from company housing. The winter of 1907 was severe. Snow piled up to 6 feet. The tent camps that sprang up outside town were barely heated. Children died of pneumonia. The camp doctor reported an outbreak of typhoid. The company did not provide medical care. The county did not have funds. The bodies were buried in unmarked graves on the hillside. The strike of 1907 is not remembered in the popular history of the gold rush. It is a footnote in labor history, but it illustrates something essential about life in a mining camp. The lawlessness was not only the violence of individual criminals, it was the lawlessness of the powerful. When the state itself is captured by private interests, the rule of law becomes a fiction. The gunfight at the OK Corral lasted 30 seconds. The war in Goldfield lasted months. The damage was deeper. After the strike, Goldfield's production peaked in 1908 and then declined. By 1910, the population had fallen from 20,000 to 5,000. The mines closed one by one. The town became a ghost camp. The jail where St. John was held is now a historical marker. The machine gun position on the roof is gone. The irony is that the gold that made the owners rich was extracted by the very men they had crushed. The wages were low. The work was dangerous. The average miner died at age 45 from lung disease or accidents. The owners lived in San Francisco. They never saw the mud. The pattern repeated across the West. In Cripple Creek, Colorado, a 2-year strike from 1903 to 1904 ended with the militia rounding up Union members and deporting them to the plains. In Telluride, the Union was destroyed by a single gunfight. In Butte, Montana, the Anaconda Copper Company controlled the entire city. The company owned the newspapers, the banks, the courts, and the police. When the miners struck in 1914, the company hired armed thugs to attack the Union Hall. The company's private army was called the Anaconda Road, but it was not a road. It was a massacre. On June 8, 1914, a confrontation left 1 miner dead and 16 wounded. The company blamed the Union. The Union blamed the company. The governor again called out the National Guard. The strike was broken. In each case, the legal system failed. The laws that existed were not enforced when it came to the mine owners. The laws that protected workers were non-existent. There was no minimum wage. There was no safety regulation. There was no workers' compensation. If a miner was killed on the job, his family received nothing. If he was injured, he was fired. The company had no obligation to provide a safe workplace. The courts had ruled that the assumption of risk was the worker's burden. If you entered a mine, you accepted the danger. That was the law. But the law was not neutral. It was written by legislators who were often themselves mine owners. In Nevada, the state assembly in 1905 was dominated by representatives from the mining counties. They passed a law that made it a felony to incite a strike. The law was used against union organizers. The same assembly also passed a law that reduced the property tax on mining claims. The result was that the mine owners paid almost nothing to the state. The roads were unpaved. The schools were poorly funded. The hospitals were run by charity. The wealth flowed out of the state. The poverty stayed. The Goldfield strike also revealed the role of the federal government. President Theodore Roosevelt had been a reformer, but he was also a pragmatist. When the governor asked for federal troops, Roosevelt sent them. The troops were not there to enforce the law. They were there to protect property, the mine owner's property. The soldiers were ordered to prevent any interference with the mine operation. They did not arrest the vigilantes. They did not investigate the explosion. They simply occupied the town. The Union was left without a voice. What the federal government did not do was investigate the financial interests behind the strike. The Goldfield Consolidated Mines Company was owned by a syndicate that included the Guggenheim family and John D. Rockefeller Jr. They had bought the property in 1905 for $60 million. They had then sold stock to the public for $200 million. The profit was enormous, but the cost of labor was a small fraction of the operating expenses. The company could have paid higher wages and still made a fortune. Why did they fight so hard? The answer is not economic. It is ideological. The mine owners believed that unions were a threat to capitalism itself. They were willing to use violence to preserve their control. The result was a generation of bitterness. The miners who survived the strike never forgot. They passed on their hatred of the company to their children. The union movement was delayed in the West for decades. It was not until the New Deal and the 193s rose that labor law was reformed. By then, most of the gold camps were already dead. The gold had been taken. The men had moved on. The scars remained. In Goldfield, the last mine closed in 1942 during World War II. The War Production Board ordered all non-essential gold mines to shut down because gold was not considered strategic. That was the end. The town survived as a ghost town. A few residents stayed. In 1957, a fire destroyed most of the remaining buildings. The courthouse burned. The jail collapsed. The machine gun position on the roof was gone. The only thing left was the desert and the stories. Those stories were collected by a historian named William H. Crook in the 1960s. He interviewed the last surviving miners. They told him about the explosion, the arrests, the machine guns. One old man who had been a union organizer in 1907 said this. They called it law and order, but it was just order. The law was whatever the company wanted. We had no say. We were just tools. They used us up and threw us away. That old man died in one night's event. He was buried in an unmarked grave in the Goldfield Cemetery. The cemetery is still there on a hill overlooking the town. The wooden markers have rotted. The names are lost. The wind blows dust over the stones. There is no monument to the strike. There is no plaque. The only record is in the archives of the Nevada Historical Society. A few letters, a few newspaper clippings, a few court documents, and the dynamite crater still visible in the gravel. The Goldfield explosion is not a famous event. It did not capture the national imagination like the shootout at the OK Corral, but it is more important. It shows how lawlessness becomes systemic. It shows how violence is used to maintain inequality. It shows how the promise of the gold rush was broken for the workers who did the digging. Today, the legacy of Goldfield is twofold. First, the environmental damage. The mines left behind thousands of tons of waste rock. The rock contains arsenic, lead, mercury, and cyanide. The groundwater is contaminated. The soil is toxic. The town has been declared a Superfund site by the Environmental Protection Agency. The cleanup is ongoing. It will cost tens of millions. The company that caused the damage is long gone. The taxpayers pay. Second, the political legacy. The battle in Goldfield was one of the sparks that led to the growth of the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW. The Wobblies, as they were called, adopted a strategy of direct action. They did not trust the courts. They did not trust the government. They believed that the only way to win was through solidarity and confrontation. The IWW led strikes across the mining West in the 1990s. They were brutally suppressed, but their ideas persisted. They influenced the labor movement for decades. The question that matters is not who set the bomb in 1990. The question is why the system allowed such a conflict to happen. The answer lies in the nature of extractive economies. Gold mining, like oil drilling and lithium extraction, is a race to get the resource out before someone else does. The profit is enormous. The time horizon is short. The owners do not care about the long-term consequences. They care about the next quarterly report. The workers are expendable. The environment is disposable. The community is temporary. This pattern did not end in Roseville. It continues today. In Nevada, the Carlin Trend is one of the largest gold deposits in the world. Mining companies use open-pit mining and cyanide heap leaching. They employ thousands of workers, but the wages are still low relative to the cost of living. The health care is minimal. The accident rate is high. In 2019, a worker was killed in a collapse at the Goldstrike mine. The company paid a fine of $76,000. Family received nothing beyond the insurance policy. In South America, gold mining has caused deforestation, mercury poisoning of rivers, and violence against indigenous communities. The governments are often corrupt. The companies are often multinational. The law is weak. The lawlessness is not a relic of the 1800s. It is a feature of the industry. And so the story of Goldfield is not just a historical episode. It is a warning. The mud and the gold and the lawlessness are still with us. The names have changed, the technology has advanced, but the human cost remains the same. The miners still die, the rivers still poison, the companies still profit. The dead still have no one to speak for them. We are still digging, and we still have not learned. At 12:28 p.m. on the 25th of January 2019, a tailings dam at the Córrego do Feijão iron ore mine in Brumadinho, Brazil, collapsed. The dam was operated by Vale, one of the world's largest mining companies. For months, internal monitoring systems had flagged rising pore pressure in the dam structure. Sensors recorded anomalies. Reports were filed. The company's own geotechnical team had rated the dam at a high risk of failure, but the warning signs were not acted on. When the dam broke, it released roughly 12 million cubic meters of iron ore tailings. The wave of mud and mining waste moved at speeds of more than 60 kilometers per hour. It surged over the mine's administrative offices, where workers were eating lunch. It buried the cafeteria, the maintenance shed, and the bus stop. It then swept through a nearby rural community named Vila Fortico. Within minutes, the mud reached the Paraopeba River. The river turned brown. The water became toxic. By the end of the day, rescuers had recovered only a handful of bodies. The mud was thick, deep, and unstable. Heavy equipment could not reach the site quickly. Helicopters struggled to land. The company initially reported that there were no fatalities. That was false. The final death toll was 270. More than 200 of them were employees of Vale or its contractors. They were workers just like the miners in Goldfield. They had families. They had mortgages. They had no control over the dam they were sitting on. What happened in the months before the collapse? The dam was a conventional upstream tailings dam, a design that had been known for decades to be prone to failure. The upstream method uses the tailings themselves to build the dam wall. The material is not engineered like concrete. It is poured in layers, and each layer relies on the previous one for support. Over time, water pressure inside the dam rises. If the drainage system fails, the dam can liquefy. In Brumadinho, the drainage system had been compromised. The company had conducted inspections, but the inspectors were under pressure to certify the dam as stable. One inspector later testified that he was told to approve the structure or lose his contract. Investigators from the Brazilian Federal Police and the Public Prosecutor's Office examined the company's internal records. They found a pattern of systematic falsification. Documents were altered. Stability certificates were issued even though the dam did not meet the required safety margins. The company had installed sensors to monitor water pressure, but the data was not reviewed in real time. The sensors had been reporting elevated readings for weeks. No one in the corporate hierarchy was informed. The communication chain was broken. There was no culture of safety. There was only a culture of production. How could this have been allowed to continue? The answer is found in the regulatory structure of Brazilian mining. The National Mining Agency was underfunded and understaffed. It had fewer than 30 inspectors to oversee more than 700 dams across the country. The agency relied on self-reporting by the mining companies. When Vail submitted its stability reports, the agency rarely conducted independent verification. The assumption was that the company would police itself. That assumption had already proven false 3 years earlier, when another Vail dam in Mariana, also in Minas Gerais, collapsed in Tuziarunafiv. That disaster killed 19 people and contaminated the Doce River for hundreds of kilometers. The company paid fines, but no executives were convicted. The dam in Mariana was also an upstream tailings dam. The same design, the same company, the same regulatory failure, and yet nothing changed. The human consequences of Brumadinho were measured not only in lives lost, but in communities destroyed. The mud buried the town of Córrego do Feijão, a settlement of about 2,000 people. The main street was wiped out. The school was not in session that day, but the bus stop where children waited was buried. 30 children were among the dead. The mud also killed dozens of birds, fish, and mammals. The Paraopa River is a tributary of the São Francisco River, one of the most important waterways in Brazil. The contamination forced the city of Belo Horizonte to shut down part of its water supply for weeks. The economic damage exceeded 7 billion reais. In the aftermath, Vail agreed to a settlement of 37 billion reais, roughly $7 billion, but the payment was structured over many years. The company continued to pay dividends to shareholders. No senior executive served prison time. The Brazilian judiciary indicted 13 employees, including former CEO Fabio Schvartzman, on charges of homicide and environmental crimes. As of 2024, the case was still in the early stages of trial. The trial was delayed by appeals, motions, and changes in judges. The legal system was slow. The victims' families waited. The structural similarities between Brumadinho and Goldfield are not accidental. In both cases, the extraction of a valuable resource created a system where the short-term profit of a few outweighed the long-term safety of many. In Goldfield, the weapon was dynamite and machine guns. In Brumadinho, the weapon was a poorly designed dam. But the underlying logic was the same. The cost of preventing disaster was judged to be higher than the cost of letting disaster happen. The difference is that in Goldfield, the disaster was a deliberate act of violence. In Brumadinho, it was a negligent act of omission. But the result was the same. Workers died. Families were destroyed. The companies continued to operate. The investigation into Brumadinho also revealed that Vail had sold bonds in international markets based on its safety record. The bonds were marketed as sustainable investments. The company had certified its operations as compliant with international security standards. That certification was later found to be misleading. The auditors had not verified the actual condition of the dam. They had accepted the company's self-reported data. The same pattern of trust without verification that had failed at Goldfield had now failed in a globalized financial system. Today, the site of the Brumadinho disaster is a memorial. The mud has been partially removed. The river is still being monitored. A memorial park was built with the names of the dead carved into stone, but the plaque at the entrance does not mention the company. It does not mention the regulatory failure. It only says, "In memory of those who perished here." The silence speaks louder than words. The lesson from Goldfield and Brumadinho is the same. The mining industry operates on a frontier that is not only geographic but legal. The laws are weak. The enforcement is weaker. The companies are powerful. The workers are replaceable. The land is disposable. The only thing that changes is the technology. The mud is still wet. The gold is still heavy. The lawlessness is still there. We are.